was the kind of winter where your breath turns to frost before you've had time to form a complaint. And let's be honest, the early settlers of North America had plenty to complain about. Bitter winds, frozen wells, and a disturbing shortage of anything resembling central heating. Still, they managed, with a few clever tricks, a lot of patience, and the kind of perseverance that only comes from wanting very badly not to die. Now imagine it. The year is 1683. Outside, the forest is a white blur. Snow stacked in lazy drifts against the trees. The sky a dull pewter that promises more snow before you've even finished this sentence. The log cabin, if we're lucky enough to have one, is about as airtight as a bundle of kindling, which, incidentally, it's made from. If you're not so lucky, you might be housed in a sod hut, which is what it sounds like. Dirt pretending to be architecture. Inside, the scene is, well, it's rustic. There's a fire, yes, but it's flickering. Glow is less warm embrace and more dim optimism. The fireplace is wide enough to walk into, but drafty enough that it almost cancels out its own warmth. One end of the room is reserved for drying herbs, salted meat, and mysteriously lumpy cheese. The other end, beds more or less. If you've ever tried sleeping on a straw mattress after someone else has used it as a pillow, a sled, and a sheep, you'll know the early settlers' definition of comfort. But still, they endured. One of their oldest secrets? Layering. Clothes were not merely adornments, they were survival systems. Flannel shifts, woolen breeches, linen chemises, mitts made from whatever was lying around, squirrel, rabbit, that one fox who looked at you funny, and cloaks thick enough to pass as portable sheds. At bedtime, you didn't so much change into pajamas as you slowly lowered yourself into deeper levels of wool. They also used the sleeping family pile, a charming tradition wherein everyone, from the smallest infant to the grumpiest patriarch, shared sleeping space in a single large bed or quilts on the floor. While today this would violate multiple fire codes and personal boundaries, back then it was just how you fought off frostbite. It also meant you didn't have to hear Aunt Margaret's ghost story about the snow witch alone in the dark. Comforting, in a way. Now, did everyone snore? Absolutely they did. But between the snoring, the fidgeting, and the whimpering of someone dreaming about being frozen like a deer in the root cellar, you kept warm. And that's what mattered. As daylight hours shortened, so did expectations for productivity. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. In the winter, early settlers adopted what could best be described as semi-hibernation. Chores were condensed into critical hours: feeding animals, splitting wood, and hauling water, often through snowdrifts taller than your enthusiasm. The rest of the time was spent near the fire, mending tools, twining thread, telling stories, and pretending not to notice that the stew was just water with dreams of potato. And that stew, it bore no resemblance to the hearty, eat-your-feelings kind we know today. The winter meal palette involved whatever you had in the root cellar, dried larder, or smoked shed. Think turnips, salted pork, fermented cabbage, and the occasional ghost of a garlic bulb. Bread was heavy, sour, and often baked once a week in bulk. It could also double as either chess pieces or emergency building material, depending on hydration levels. Tea wasn't necessarily the calming herbal elixir we think of. Sure, if you'd stocked actual tea leaves, you were doing well. But for many frontier families, tea was made from pine needles or boiled bark, which, though technically warm, tasted suspiciously like despair. To cope, they told stories. Long, meandering tales meant to stretch the hours and distract from how much colder your left foot was than your right. Children sat wide-eyed, sometimes because of wonder, more often because their eyelids were frozen open. Adults drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by firelight and the thousandth retelling of why grandfather hates spoons. These weren't just tales. They were a kind of oral insulation. Stories wrung warmth from the cold. They bound people together, across generations, across winters, across nights so long, they seemed to loop back into the last ice age. And so they huddled, sighed, and survived. Not with ease, but with ingenuity. Not with comfort, but with community. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's ease now gently into another scene. Imagine, if you will, a cabin, more draft than dwelling, tucked between frostbitten trees and an almost poetic amount of snow. Thick, pillowy drifts blanketed nearly everything, including the hope for warm toes. It's the late 1600s somewhere in colonial New England, and winter had thundered in like an overzealous theatre volunteer, dramatic, uninvited, and thoroughly committed to the role. Life for early settlers was a bit like camping, only colder, more dangerous, and without the assurance of s'mores. Their homes were often one-room wooden structures built in a tremendous hurry before the first snowfall. These cabins had gaps you could see through, walls thinner than a pilgrim's patience, and no central heating, unless you count burning half the furniture by February. Now, inside this humble log Tetris known as a home, the fireplace was not a cozy Instagram backdrop. It was survival. The hearth was the heart, lungs, and digestive system of the household. It provided warmth, cooked your questionable stew, and in a pinch, dried your damp socks to a crunchy crisp. But let's not romanticize it too much. These fireplaces were drafty, inefficient, and quite skilled at turning a house into a slow-motion smokehouse. Settlers became experts in the fine art of smelling like brisket. Fueling the fire took effort. Wood didn't magically appear, despite the dramatic abundance of trees. Every chopped log was a calorie-weighted decision. Should one venture into the snow to fell another frozen tree? Or simply hope that shivering produces enough friction to generate heat? A tough call. And it wasn't always the men braving the woods. Women and children often helped haul timber, their footsteps crunching through snow as if they were helping to prop up civilization one frostbitten toe at a time. But even with a fire blazing night and day, temperatures indoors still skidded somewhere between root cellar and we can see our breath. Beds were often placed near the hearth, where entire families huddled together, including Granny, the twins, the dog, and occasionally a turkey in temporary exile from the coal barn. Personal space was a modern luxury. Back then, body heat was more lucrative than gold. And about those beds, picture this: a straw mattress, lovingly stuffed with whatever wasn't already food or firewood. Sometimes corn husks, sometimes dried leaves, always mildly disappointing. Bed sheets, if they existed at all, were hand-spun and predictably lumpy. Quilts were stitched from worn-out clothes, scrap cloth, and the lingering hope that winter might show mercy. Spinning and weaving were winter pastimes, because if you weren't busy spinning thread by the fire, you might notice how cold your nose was. Idle noses were especially at risk. Settlers wore layers to bed. Not fancy layers, mind you. Think wool petticoats, linen shifts, and homemade socks that gave up halfway down the ankle. People slept in their clothes, and sometimes their clothes slept on them. A good wool cap kept the noggin warm, and a few folks even swore by tucking warmed stones under the blanket as makeshift radiators. Of course, if the stone still had a little ash on it, well, consider it rustic exfoliation. Windows, such as they were, didn't offer much insulation. Glass was expensive and rare. Most used oiled paper or animal hides, stretched taut to let in light while limiting the wind's sense of entitlement. In retrospect, putting translucent greasy paper over a hole in the wall seems optimistic, brave even. But this was an era when optimism was considered a survival skill. If the window rattled too much, you simply stuffed it with moss. Problem solved, nature approved. And the food. Cold weather diets were utilitarian at best. Root vegetables stored in cellars, preserved meats, and dense loaves of bread so heavy they could injure someone if improperly sliced. Dinners were eaten quickly, by firelight, with spoons carved from whatever tree hadn't been invited to the fireplace. If you were fortunate, you had a bit of salt pork and perhaps a turnip to challenge the monotony. Soup was popular, not because it was delicious, but because a warm spoonful could double as a make-believe spa treatment for your face. Still, despite the teeth-chattering conditions and drafty architecture, settlers persisted. They adapted, complained creatively, and learned the fine art of surviving through equal parts determination and layering. A successful night meant waking up with most toes still where you left them. As the cold moon froze over chimney smoke and hearth fires burned low, our early settlers pulled the quilt up to their chins and whispered a silent prayer, not just for warmth, but for a morning slightly less frigid. And perhaps, just perhaps, a bit of sun. And in the stillness of the snowy dawn, we turn gently now to the world outside those frosty windows, where the animals withstood winter in ways no less curious or determined. If you are imagining a colonial homestead, pause the mental movie right there. Freeze frame on the snow-covered wooden cabin, smoke curling gently from the chimney like it too, is pondering its life choices. Good. Now let's step inside, but slowly, because the door creaks louder than an overworked diary. The inside isn't exactly postcard material. This was not an era known for interior design. It was more, shall we say, functional chic, with a generous splash of "we hope we survived till spring" aesthetic. Walls were often chinked with a mixture of mud and straw, which, while not winning any awards for insulation, beat having holes that let in starlight and regret. The houses, small and square, usually featured a single room. Multi-room homes were for those exceedingly ambitious settlers who had either struck luck with fur, land, or a particularly industrious grandmother. True luxury meant partitioning off a bedroom with a blanket or hanging dried fish between sleeping areas for both privacy and dinner. At the heart of the home, both figuratively and literally, was the fireplace. It was less of a cozy, marshmallow roasting hearth and more of a blackened, ash-dusted furnace for brute survival. It gave heat, light, and a place to cook whatever root vegetable hadn't gone suspiciously squishy. Early settlers relied heavily on this stone and smoke contraption to keep the chill from marching directly into their bones. If the fire went out overnight, and sometimes it did, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an emergency. Imagine waking at 3 a.m. to find your toes have unionized and declared independence from the rest of your body due to hostile freezing conditions. To prevent such dramas, someone, the unfortunate soul, voted least fond of sleep, was often appointed fire watcher. Their job? Keep the embers alive through the night by feeding the fire modest offerings of wood, bark, and whatever sticks weren't being used to hold up the walls. Speaking of wood, yes, the endless chopping. Wood was less a chore and more a lifestyle. Men, women, children, with arms strong enough to swing and enough common sense not to aim at their own feet, took shifts feeding the woodpile. Logs weren't just for heating. They were winter's rent, and the forests, plentiful as they were, seemed to mock settlers with their icy indifference. Keeping the home warm involved a rustic ballet of logistics. Firewood had to be dry, preferably seasoned for 6 to 12 months, which meant the family needed to plan ahead amid all their summer fun, like fighting dysentery and harvesting questionable turnips. Logs were stacked in neat piles near the house, though only the top layer was ever completely dry. The rest, deep inside the mound, lurked in various stages of herbal tea dampness. Clever families also built features to outwit the cold. Rugs, not woven but crafted from animal hides, helped insulate both floors and bodies. Some settlers even tacked hides between the ceiling beams to trap warm air, or, whenever an engineer in training came to visit, attempted to construct heat-lofting platforms near the fire, where the warm air rose. They'd sleep up there like wood-smoke-drowsy birds, faces pinked with radiant heat, and dreams gently seasoned with squirrel stew. Now don't go thinking they didn't have blankets. They did. Piles upon piles, most of them homemade from wool, animal hides, or whatever could be bartered from neighbors who owed them one from the infamous potato incident of 1692 to be exact. These blankets weighed somewhere between a firm hug and mild bear trap, which is precisely how they liked it in the dead of a January night. And so they survived, by sheer stubbornness, a little ingenuity, and a slightly worrying comfort with sleeping next to potatoes stored in sacks inside their own homes. For warmth, of course. Also dinner. As the snow piled quietly against the window boards and the fire cracked its sleepy rhythm of survival. Families whispered around embers, trading stories or hushing children with songs passed down from distant shores. Outside, the wind howled like it had unresolved personal issues. Inside, however, the world was small, simple, and warm enough to carry them through another frozen night. Now that our toes are toasty and our historical fire well stoked, perhaps we might explore precisely how the earlier settlers fed themselves during this frosty season, without succumbing to spice withdrawals or cabbage fatigue. If you were a colonial settler gazing out at the brittle horizon of a snowy December morning, you'd probably be wondering if your toes were still attached to your feet, or if they'd silently resigned sometime in the night. The wind wasn't just a breeze. It was a medieval insult. And yet, somehow, our ancestors managed to survive winters that would make the interior of a freezer look toasty by comparison. Without modern heating, electric blankets, or even a mildly functioning radiator with a name like Old Rusty. The secret, as it happens, wasn't one thing. It was many small things, layered with the stubborn determination only possible when your survival depends on it, and perhaps a little wool. Let's begin with houses, tiny, grumbling structures made of timber and wheels of iron. If you ever stepped into an 18th century settler's cabin, your first impression might be, well, this is cozy. Your second thought might be, why is my breath visible indoors? Most structures were 1 or 2 room log cabins, knotty walls, dirt or wood floors, and ceilings so low that tall men developed both humility and chronic neck issues. Insulation wasn't so much installed as it was improvised. Gaps between logs were filled with a mix known as chinking, a glorious casserole of mud, straw, moss, and anything else sticky that didn't protest aloud. It worked decently until the mud cracked from cold, fell out, and was politely replaced season after season. Windows, rarer than a warm biscuit by February, were covered in oiled paper or animal bladder. Yes, truly. Allowing light in, but keeping most of the elements out. The key word here is most. Inside, it was all about proximity to the hearth. Not the metaphorical one, the actual one. The fireplace, wide enough to roast a boar if you happen to find one volunteering, was the steadfast heart of winter survival. It wasn't just for cooking. It was the singular heat source and by default, the neighborhood gossip hub, sleepover location, and occasional emergency drying rack for damp goats. Settlers spent hours, days really, meticulously splitting and stacking firewood. You didn't just burn any old stick. Oh no. Wood had to be seasoned, dried at least 6 months in advance, or risk choking the cabin with cloying smoke and judgmental creaks from the chimney. Hardwoods like oak, hickory, or maple were the aristocrats of firewood. They burned hotter and lasted longer. Softwoods, by comparison, were somewhat scandalous, spitting out sparks, burning too fast, and leaving bedsheets looking slightly singed. Fun fact, some settlers brought a tradition known as the banked fire. Every night, before retiring, they'd carefully cover embers with ashes to insulate them and keep them smouldering until morning. If successful, they could stir them with a breath and a prayer the next day, coaxing the fire back to life, like a very slow and cautious phoenix. Nighttime was an exercise in both optimism and layering. Blankets, few and handmade. Settlers used quilts so thick they could double as modest battlements. Nightcaps weren't whimsical fashion statements, but practical accessories designed to prevent you from waking up with frost crisping your scalp. People slept in shifts and in close huddles. The family piled in like tree rings around the center of warmth. And yes, sometimes livestock shared space, particularly if you were the kind of farmer who whispered sweet nothings to your milk cow or worried that your chickens preferred the parlor's ambience. Sharing body warmth was less weird and more of an insurance plan. The chicken might not have had thrilling conversation, but it kept your nose from freezing off. Now, if you're wondering what they ate to keep their internal furnaces stoked, well, that's a whole other steaming bowl of quirks. Think of stews thick enough to stand a spoon upright, fermented things best not described before bed, and root vegetables starring in more meals than one might consider polite. But before we forage into early American comfort food and the curious politics of turnip storage, let's gently snuff out the candle of this chapter. The fire in the hearth is still glowing softly, and the logs settle with a sound that's halfway between a sigh and a sleepy whisper. All is quiet, except for the wind outside, threading through the trees like an old folk song. Cold, yes, but no match for stubborn souls, good firewood, and 13 wool blankets sewn by candlelight. By mid-November, the air itself seemed to have grown teeth. It bit noses, nipped at fingers, and gnawed its way beneath even the most stubbornly layered petticoats and breeches. And yet, for early settlers, this was simply the opening overture to what they'd affectionately call a proper winter, and what modern humans might more accurately term a relentless seasonal punishment with occasional frostbite. You see, before central heating and electric blankets, warmth wasn't something you dialed up. It was an achievement, a team sport, a shape-shifting game of who can survive the longest without losing a toe. Inside their drafty cabins, which were often about as airtight as a strainer turned upside down, early colonists had to get creative in the war against winter's icy fingernails. The first thing you'd notice upon entering one of these homes wasn't the decor, which was mostly wood with accents of more wood, but the fire, a crackling heart at the center of the room, as hard-working and irritable as a colonial blacksmith with a head cold. Fireplaces did a heroic amount of heavy lifting. They cooked the food, dried the socks, scared off the chill, and occasionally burnt down the house if someone got a little too cavalier with the kindling. Still, they were tragically inefficient by today's standards. For every tablespoon of heat that stayed inside, several buckets of warmth wafted uninvited up the chimney like a bad joke. So, settlers layered up. Wool was the fabric of survival, scratchy, smelly, but steadfast. Men stuffed themselves into breeches, stockings, shirts, waistcoats, and coats, while women bundled beneath petticoats, shifts, stays, shawls, and caps, creating silhouettes that, on windy days, might roll instead of walk. At night, they retired to bedchambers that were cooled to perfection by large, ill-fitting windows and walls built by optimism rather than insulation. Families often shared beds out of necessity, pressing themselves together like spoonfuls of slightly terrified oatmeal. For those who lived alone, a hot brick wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed acted as both heating device and, arguably, a bedtime companion. Because nothing says romance quite like a chunk of Earth's crust dressed in linen. Of course, there were those blessed with masonry privilege. If you were lucky enough to own a home with a beehive oven smouldering at the back, you could cheat nature a little. After a good day's baking, these ovens stayed warm long into the night, if you didn't mind your walls occasionally auditioning as a sauna. But perhaps the most curious invention of all was the bed warmer, a shallow metal pan filled with coals attached to a long handle. Settlers would slip this contraption between the bed sheets just before turning in, sliding it back and forth like a slow-motion fencing match with the devil himself. The goal was to warm the bed without setting it alight, a delicate dance that required both patience and an excellent homeowner's insurance plan, which of course no one had. Now, lest we imagine our ancestors spent every evening huddled in misery, we must give credit where it is due. Winter, for all its frostbitten moodiness, offered something rather precious too: time. With the fields frozen and daytime hours shortened, families spent long evenings indoors, spinning tales by firelight, mending clothes by candle, and trying to ignore Uncle Silas's long-winded theories about why chickens probably caused the last thunderstorm. There were songs sung in half-whispers, stories that grew taller with each retelling, and the subtle wonder of realizing that even in the face of bitter cold and biting winds, the shared warmth of community, however cramped, however scratchy, could turn a dark winter's night into something close to magic. And so they carried on, wrapped in wool and wit, fortified by soup and stubbornness. Each ember in the hearth glowed with quiet defiance. Each draft under the door was met with another quilt, another prayer, or in some cases, a strongly worded muttering about the carpenter's questionable craftsmanship. Outside, the snow continued its soft dominion, piling up quietly, as if the earth, like the people who walked upon it, needed a long, deep rest. And as the wind howled its ancient lullaby through the trees, those within closed their eyes, dreaming not just of warmer days, but of the curious comforts they'd discovered in the cold. Soon, in a small log cabin nestled in the hush of the wilderness, someone would attempt to make candles from scratch, with livestock tallow, smoky ambition, and a very questionable smell. But that, as always, is a story for another firelight. If you were a colonial settler staring down the barrel of a howling January wind, you didn't ask much of life. Just a roof that didn't collapse under snow, boots that didn't swallow your toes, and food that didn't bite back in the dark. But above all else, you craved fire, the flickering ambassador of civilization and warmth, preferably one that didn't burn your house down accidentally. Fire, back then, wasn't just comforting, it was crucial. Without it, your stew turned into soup cycles and your body into something unpleasantly statue-like. Yet making fire, now that was a process, not a button. You couldn't just shout at a metal cylinder and have it respond with heat and soft jazz music. You had to coax it, charm it, flirt with it using flint, tinder, and sighs of frustration. Let's talk about hearths. In a world before radiators and thermostats that made a gentle click and then rewarded you with gentle whoosh noises and central heating, the hearth was king. It was the literal heart of the home, which is why the phrase hearth and home had such weight to it. Families didn't just gather near the fireplace, they revolved around it like moths doing laps around the sun. Entire domestic ecosystems hovered close to the blaze. Children played in its radius. Grandparents dozed in rocking chairs, wrapped in wool and stories. Cats plotted their takeover of the cabin from the corner. Now, a settler's fireplace was no dainty thing with decorative logs and orange Christmas lights pretending to glow. Oh no, these hearths were meaty chambers of survival fury, 6 feet wide by 4 feet tall, often taking up a whole wall. Huge iron cranes swung out awkwardly like misunderstood gymnasts, holding bubbling cauldrons of stews thick enough to patch a roof. There were spits, trivets, kettles, grates, and toasting forks. It was part fireplace, part Mad Max cooking arena. And you didn't just burn any wood willy-nilly either. No, sir. This was winter warfare, and you had to know your lignification. Hardwoods like oak, hickory, and maple burned hot and slow. Softwoods, like pine, were for kindling or amusing your neighbors with sudden chimney fires. A good settler knew to season wood for at least 6 months to a year. In other words, your firewood had its own calendar. Oh, this stack, it's for the winter of '86, no touching. Of course, heating went beyond just fireplaces. The humble bed, once a place of mere repose, became a strategic heat retention fortress. People slept under mountains of quilts so heavy, you needed help turning over. Some households had feather beds atop straw, ticking stuffed with sheepish secrets. And in truly elegant operations, there were even bed warmers, essentially bronze pans filled with coals, slid between sheets to create a brief hot zone before the embers ate through your linens. And let's not forget, beds weren't always solo voyages. It was common for entire families, or at the very least, children like curly-haired sardines, to sleep together for warmth. This wasn't necessarily cozy. It was pragmatic. Elbows in ribs were simply the collateral damage of communal thawing. Speaking of warmth sharing with a slight side of awkward, let us not overlook the baffling genius of the foot warmer. Essentially, a mini-box stove, usually tin or brass, that you placed at your feet while sitting, or, if feeling adventurous, carting it to church. These foot warmers were filled with smouldering embers or hot stones and cradled like precious puppies under heavy blankets. If you've ever wanted to feel both scorched and grateful, you would have appreciated one. But even with all these contraptions, clever adaptations, and steaming turnip stews, there came a point in every long, icy stretch of January when the cold seemed to sneak through everything, sashes, dreams, conversations, and lodge itself into the bones. And that's when settlers relied on something far older and warmer than any hearth: companionship. Neighbors looked in on each other, not with text, messages, but with woven baskets and knock-knuckle greetings. Hearty suppers were shared in cramped sitting rooms as fiddle tunes stitched sound into silent snow. Children played by firelight or huddled for sleepy storytelling, their laughter rising like sparks. The cold may have been unrelenting, but it didn't stand much chance against stubborn community. And so the long season wore on, not always comfortably, rarely easily, but always together. As frost weeks deepened and icicles thickened like crystal stalactites, the fire still burned, people still bundled, and somewhere in the spinning rhythm of winter, someone discovered an even older trick. Laughter helps keep you warm. Next, under the low eaves of sod-roof shelters and the soft scrape of snowshoes on icy trails, we'll wander into the curious art of winter clothing, because nothing says I am ready for sub-zero drama quite like a linen shirt, 10 layers of wool, and, surprisingly often, elk moccasins. When winter settled its quiet weight upon the early colonies, life became a bit like camping inside a wooden box that creaked louder than your grandpa's knees and smelled faintly of turnips. But however bleak things might have seemed, the settlers had a surprisingly long list of tricks, traditions, and questionable logic to keep their fingers from freezing off. First, let's talk fashion. Winter wear in those days wasn't about aesthetics. No slim-fit goose-down puffers or thermal leggings. No, the early settler bundled up in layers that would make a modern hiker weep. Undergarments, wool, scratchy and earnest. Outer layers, even scratchier wool. If you were really stylish, you might also layer on a deer hide or two. Add a cloak that made you look like either an exhausted wizard or a cabbage merchant, and voila, you were ready for the great outdoors. Or, more realistically, the 27-foot trek to the outhouse. But indoors was where the real wintering strategies took place. Log cabins were built solid, though not always sensibly. Chinks between logs were sealed with mud, clay, or moss. Whatever could be smooshed into a gap with a stick and hope. Drafts were common, and the wind had a strange way of making itself an intrusive house guest, slipping under the door and whistling through the walls like an opinionated ghost. To counter such breeziness, settlers turned to their best friend, the hearth. It wasn't just a fireplace, it was the central command post of the home. A glowing, soot-smudged throne around which all life revolved. Cooking, heating water, drying socks, and occasionally singeing a toe or two while warming boots too close to the coals. It was the heart and soul of winter survival, and also the reason every colonial child had the burnt ends of a broomstick somewhere in their memory. Now, while the fireplace roared its uneven symphony, the rest of the house tried, and mostly failed, to retain warmth. Blankets were piled on beds like soft fortresses. Featherbeds, though luxurious, could only do so much when windows rattled like tambourines in a storm. So people slept close, very close. Entire families often snuggled up, not particularly from affection, but because body heat is a magical thing when your thermometer is frozen and you don't have a thermometer. These sleep piles were known less romantically as bundling and included a variety of arrangements, some cozy, some complicated, and some downright awkward. In less spacious homes, you might find yourself spooning next to 3 siblings, a visiting uncle, and a dog with unidentifiable odors. Privacy was a concept entirely foreign to survival mode. Speaking of animals, they weren't just family if they had names. They were heaters with legs. Farm animals were sometimes brought indoors during the harshest nights. Chickens clucked contentedly by the door. Pigs found nooks near the hearth. Cows, large and slightly bewildered, were occasionally tucked into corners of barns attached directly to homes. Early settlers understood something modern people sometimes forget. If a creature gives you warmth, love, or bacon, you should probably keep it nearby. Food-wise, the winter pantry was a shrine of culinary hope. There were root cellars, usually dug into the earth, dark and damp and lined with shelves covered in jars and sacks, and the occasional squeak. Here'd be pickles, sauerkraut, dried beans, salted meats, and enough turnips to inspire a lifetime of poetic metaphors about suffering. Hot drinks were a blessing of the era. Warm cider spiced with cloves, thick, heated molasses mixed with hot water for what they called switchel, a drink that was either deliciously old-fashioned or definitively a bad idea. Tea, if available, was brewed with reverence, though sometimes it was made from herbs that smelled suspiciously like whatever had been trodden on in the garden that morning. On stormy nights, when gusts howled like lost banshees across the roofs, settlers would gather close. They told stories of home, of legends, of the time Silas tried to dry his pants by the fire too quickly and discovered both the volatility of wool and the upper limits of human embarrassment. Whatever the crisis, the settlers did what humans always do. They made do. They adapted. They shared. They laughed carefully, so as not to jiggle the icicles hanging from their eyebrows. And so, huddled in their patchwork nests of blankets and barn smells, illuminated by the flickering light of a stubborn fire, they waited for the distant promise of spring, or at least a morning where the basin of water hadn't turned to ice. In the next room, perhaps someone was softly playing a fiddle, or snoring like a wheelbarrow full of disgruntled ducks. But far from a scene of hardship, this was comfort of a sort. Hand-carved and soot-smeared, yes, but woven with camaraderie and an almost endearing stubbornness. Just as the snow deepened outside, like a sigh from the earth itself, we'll drift gently toward how these chilly souls managed to feed themselves with frozen soil and 5 root vegetables. As the first serious frost blanketed the earth and the last leaves gave up their grip on the trees, early settlers entered a season they didn't so much greet as survive. Winter, you see, wasn't so much a peaceful snow-dusted postcard as it was a months-long stress test of human stubbornness. And when central heating was still a figment of the far-flung future, and weighted blankets were, well, just regular heavy quilts, people had to get creative with staying warm without freezing their extremities off. Let's begin with the heart of the homestead, the hearth. If the house had one, and it didn't smoke everyone out like a moody dragon, then the fireplace became a friend, a food source, and practically a third parent. Hearth fires were kept burning almost continuously through the cold months, not necessarily because the settlers were sentimental, but because reigniting a fire from scratch every morning in the time of flint and friction was approximately as fun as chewing on icicles. It also made one quite familiar with the concept of patience, or frostbite. Now, heating a drafty log cabin with a single fireplace is a little like trying to warm a swimming pool with a scented candle. Heat didn't politely circulate itself through the house. No, it crouched stubbornly near the fire, while the rest of the place remained a brisk, invigorating 40 degrees, colder in the corners, where socks went to die. To compensate, settlers layered clothing like lasagna. Wool was the holy grail of warmth, a material so valuable that sheep were often treated better than guests. A good woolen undershirt, overshirt, over-overshirt, coat, and cap could keep one reasonably toasty unless, of course, it got wet. At that point, it took on the noble duty of freezing directly to your torso. Nighttime was a different ordeal altogether. Bedrooms, if the structure even had such luxuries, might have windows with oiled paper instead of glass, which is a poetic way of saying the wind had visiting rights. Beds became survival pods, bundled in layers of blankets so thick you'd need a friend or forklift to roll over. Families huddled together. Yes, even the awkward cousin with a snore like an injured goose. Staying warm trumped personal space. And that, dear listener, is how the original family bed turned into both a furnace alternative and a community-building experience, whether the community wanted it or not. Within some cabins, there was the nighttime parade of the warming pan. Imagine a frying pan on a stick, filled with glowing coals and gently slid like a cautious curling stone between the sheets. The idea was noble. Pre-warm the bed for fewer evening shrieks. It was effective. It was genius. It was also a breathtaking gamble between pleasantly toasty and accidental arson. This is why it was often a task assigned to the level-headed elder of the family, or the swiftest child, depending on everyone's preferred risk tolerance. If you were daring, or just dreadfully poor, you might have gone the bedfellow chicken route. Yes, people sometimes brought in livestock. Not entire herds, mind you, just a few portable members of the barnyard like small dogs, cats, or on truly desperate nights, a hen. Feathers are nature's insulation after all. And should the chicken lay an egg? Breakfast in bed. Settler multitasking at its finest. Food, too, had a role in temperature control. Not simply through the actual act of cooking over the fire, though that helped, but by what one ate. Winter diets leaned heavily on stews, porridges, and anything that could plausibly be called hearty. Root vegetables, salt-cured meats, and sorrowful-looking dried apples were standbys. These dishes offered calories and warmth, and if you ate quickly enough, you could momentarily forget you couldn't feel your toes. Some settlers had the great fortune or mild regret of living in communities with more technological sophistication, where iron stoves began to replace the open hearth. These cast iron marvels distributed heat more evenly and came in delightful styles such as boxy, even boxier, and slightly scorched by last night's stew accident. They were heavy, temperamental, and provided delightful surface burns at the faintest touch, sort of like a medieval radiator crossed with an emotional support appliance. But perhaps the most surprising method of warmth was storytelling. When the fire was lit low and everyone was wrapped in furs like strangely articulate burritos, out came the folk tales, ghost stories, and dubious family lore. Words filled the gaps that warmth could not. And in those moments, among the creaking logs, the scent of wood smoke, and the slow drift of snow falling outside, the chill of winter softened, if only a little. As the night deepened and families listened to voices bouncing through the flickering candlelight, another day of cold survival gently closed its chapter. And somewhere beyond the silence, with snow thickening against the window panes, another humble miracle was underway. The morning's first hint of warmth, to be carried not just by fire, but hands, human and wool-wrapped, always preparing for what would come next. Winter nights on the frontier were the kind that crept into your bones, pulled up a chair by your spine, and refused to leave. They didn't knock. They simply arrived, blanketing the world in silence and rhyme, and making even the most stubborn roosters reconsider their commitment to early mornings. But where there is frost, there is also ingenuity, and just a dash of human stubbornness wrapped in wool. Now, if you're imagining quaint log cabins glowing from within like gingerbread houses, with everyone gathered around a roaring fire, holding mugs of steaming herbal mystery, well, yes and no. Early settlers did indeed aspire to that vision. The reality, though, was often more splintery. To start, let's talk about the fireplace, the undisputed monarch of winter survival. Ah yes, the fireplace, equal parts lifesaver and smoke machine. It was typically a monumental stone structure in the middle of the main room, not just for cooking, but because central heating had yet to show up fashionably late by about 200 years. Settlers would burn whatever wood they could find, oak if they were lucky, pine if they were desperate, and mystery twigs if they were out of everything else. Fires would smolder through the night, often banked with ashes just before bed, an early version of putting the fire on sleep mode. If it failed, well, your nose might freeze to your own mustache by sunrise. But the true beauty of winter survival wasn't just in the fire. It was in how people adapted everything around it. The hearth wasn't just for heat and cooking. It was also for drying wet socks, warming up ink to write religious thoughts or grocery lists, which mostly consisted of get more firewood, and housing the occasional cat willing to serve as a makeshift foot warmer. Yet, even the best fire could not be everywhere at once. Cabins were notoriously drafty, often made from hastily notched logs, not yet tight enough to keep out both the wind and curious mice. So settlers had to get creative. They employed what historians affectionately call bed-warming strategies, which included heated bricks wrapped in cloth placed under the covers, cuddling up to livestock-sized dogs, or, if all else failed, sleeping with a fellow family member, children included, piled together like particularly chilly pancakes. Now, while bed-warming pans sound luxurious, don't be fooled. They were basically metal pans filled with embers, slid between sheets to chase out the chill, and sometimes accidentally said sheets on fire. It was the early settler version of playing with matches in bed, which, for the record, we still don't recommend. Of course, insulation was key, and here, settlers proved themselves rather resourceful. Walls were often chinked with a mixture of mud and straw, an earthy plaster sometimes referred to as daub. It cracked in the cold, collected bugs in the summer, and had a certain artisanal rustle when the wind blew hard. But it kept the worst of the chill out, mostly. Windows, if they had them at all, were single-paned and fit loosely, as if glass had timidly shown up to a party it wasn't sure it was invited to. This meant winter drafts were regular guests, and curtains were thick, woolen affairs. If that didn't suffice, settlers simply nailed oil-soaked paper over the window frame, turning their view of the world into a slightly flammable smudge. Even clothing doubled as survival gear. People didn't undress to sleep unless they were feeling wildly confident. Linen shifts and woolen nightcaps were the pajama set of the day. Quilts were stacked so high that once a child was tucked in, they weren't seen again until spring, or until someone dug them out to help with the morning chores, whichever came first. And food. Oh, the food. If you snuck out of bed to peek into the simmering pot hanging over the fire, you'd likely find a stew that had been evolving for several days, sometimes with portions living, if you will, in overlapping centuries. Early winter stews became late winter stews with fresh ingredients added as needed. It was sustenance, yes, but also sort of a family pet. Despite all these challenges, there was something profoundly cozy in the way settlers responded to winter. It wasn't just about enduring. It was about wrapping life in wool, tallow, and team spirit. Neighbors shared salted pork, swapped firewood for homemade mittens, and gathered for communal storytelling. A social event and antiperspirant-free sauna brought to you by shared body heat. And as the moon rose over frozen fields and cabins glowed with flickering firelight, the long winter night slowly wrapped itself around the sleeping homesteads like a hand-stitched quilt. Cold on the outside, warm beneath. In the next quiet moment, let's step away from the hearth and into another wintry wonder. How settlers kept their food from freezing, or sometimes froze it on purpose. A curious dance with cold coming soon, when the frost hit hard and the wind moaned through the chinks of wooden walls like a ghost with unresolved opinions. Early settlers turned to something far more dependable than insulation. Layers. Yes, dear listener, not metaphorical layers of emotional resilience, though those were certainly useful, but literal, itchy, woolen layers, stacked like pancakes of warmth and discomfort. You see, the art of not freezing into a colonial popsicle began with one's undergarments. These were oftentimes made of linen, a fabric that was breathable, renewable, and alarmingly honest about the ambient temperature. Over these, one might don a flannel shirt or perhaps a wool chemise, thick enough to insult the wind, yet thin enough to occasionally allow movement. Next came breeches or petticoats, which had as many variants as the moon has phases. And then, because winter was nothing if not relentless in its personal vendettas, settlers piled on greatcoats, cloaks, shawls, mittens, mufflers and hats made of anything from beaver fur to sheer desperation. If it could be wrapped, it was. If it couldn't be wrapped, they tried anyway. There was a technique known as bundling up, which now means tucking your child into a stroller with one too many jackets. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, it meant a person layering to the point that their silhouette resembled either a small haystack or an overconfident cabbage. The more one resembled a produce display with arms, the safer they were from Jack, Frost's rather aggressive advances. But warmth wasn't just sartorial. Houses played their part too, though they did so with the reluctant enthusiasm of a slightly reformed criminal. The early settler home was not so much insulated as it was wood adjacent, timber logs barely pressed together, sealed with mud, moss, or whatever the local fauna wasn't currently using. Windows, where they existed, were covered in oil-soaked paper or thin glass that did absolutely nothing to discourage a draft with ambition. So, the hearth became the heart of the home. And not simply in a poetic sense. Quite literally, this blazing void of firewood and smoke was the only thing standing between a family and hypothermic regret. Families would gather around it like moths, like loyal supplicants, or like people who ever so slightly feared freezing in their sleep, because they did. At night, they employed what modernity has made nearly extinct, the bed warmer. This was often a metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals, ideal for preheating the bed and also for pretending that technology had advanced beyond softly glowing rocks. It was a delicate operation, of course. Knock the bed warmer a bit too hard against the feather mattress, and suddenly the quest for comfort turned into an unplanned barn fire. Cozy, yes, but with consequences. Speaking of beds, settlers often slept several to a room, even multiple to a bed, not simply for lack of space, but for shared body heat, which in the wintertime made your brother-in-law's snoring a small price to pay. Children, too, were tucked in like pastries beneath quilts, nestled between siblings, grandparents, and the occasional inexplicably fearless cat. Quilts themselves were masterpieces of domestic defense. Some were patchworks of necessity, made from scraps of old dresses, trousers, and flour sacks. Others, lovingly stitched in patterns dense enough to stop a breeze and maybe even hurt its feelings. Quilting became a communal winter activity, an indoor sport of survival wrapped in the illusion of art. And it was art truly, but art that could lower your risk of frostbite. Of course, nothing says I'm warm at heart like food, and so settlers often consumed winter meals that bordered on thermal insulation. Stews simmered for hours, root vegetables, hunks of salted meat, all melded in a cauldron thick with flavor and vague animal memories. The warmth of such a meal could fortify even the most reluctant snow shoveler. And for dessert, a mug of hot molasses water, or, if you were lucky, syllabub, a whipped delight that sounds like a sneeze but tastes far better. In the end, the early settlers' winter wardrobe, home, and dinner table all worked together in a wool and smoke-scented alliance against the cold. Not always elegantly, not always comfortably, but almost always successfully. And just as the fire settled into embers, glowing like sleepy eyes behind soot-fringed lids, the night carried in quieter thoughts, and perhaps stories murmured under blankets about seasons past. Because once you've swaddled yourself like a burrito, filled your belly with carrot-laden stew, and huddled with your peculiar but warm family, there's not much else to do but wait. Wait for morning, and prepare for the snow-choked affair known as water collection. But that too has its marvels. As the December sun made its reluctant appearance, barely grazing the tops of snow-crusted trees with a moody golden hue, another essential, if often unheralded, hero of winter survival stirred quietly in the early settler's cabin. Insulation that wasn't insulation. Not in the way we know it, anyway. There was no pink fiberglass, no foam boards labeled R-value, and certainly no YouTube tutorials about sealing drafts with expanding foam and ambition. No, settlers had to get a little more inventive, or perhaps just stubbornly accepting. First, there were the walls themselves. In many cabins, especially those in the New England backwoods, the logs were laid tight, but they still weren't tight enough for January's breathless howling. So settlers chinked the gaps with what they had. That meant clay, mud, moss, straw, or, in an act of genuine domestic hope, a little horsehair if your mare was shedding and you had more optimism than insulation. Did this keep the cold out completely? No, but it did make the walls look like they just returned from a very hearty mud wrestling championship. Function before fashion, always. Inside, insulation was less about architecture and more about layering. Imagine dressing your entire home in a series of coats from the inside. Hanging thick quilts on walls wasn't just decorative. It was an act of thermal rebellion. Housewives would piece together heavy drapery from old blankets and worn-out garments, creating a patchwork that was aesthetically confusing but physically effective. Floorboards, often hastily assembled from whatever sawmill scraps were available, leaked heat like a gossip with a secret. So rugs were layered like sedimentary rock. A fur pelt here, a tattered rug there, the dear memory of a wolf who wandered too close, now repurposed as cozy toe covering. But above all, the real domestic miracle was the windows. Those fragile portals to the eternal whiteness outside. How to keep the cold from seeping in through them. In wealthier homes, or in cases of extreme optimism, they might have had glass panes, thin, imperfect, wobbly glass that muffled the snowstorm visually, but not thermally. More often than not, oiled parchment paper was used as a substitute. Yes, parchment. Like the Declaration of Independence, only slightly greasier and much more enthusiastic about domestic service. Settlers would stretch it across the window frames, coat it in animal fat or linseed oil, and let it dry. The result? A sort of frosted glass effect that looked like your window had a cataract, but it blocked wind and let in just enough light to continue hunting for your misplaced left mitten. Now, for particularly drafty evenings, and let's be honest, most evenings were, mattresses might be moved closer to the hearth. But hearths weren't some all-night Netflix fireplace loop. They roared when fed and sulked when not. So warmth was an enterprise involving embers fanned gently, logs rationed like gold, and children stacked lovingly like cordwood for shared body heat. Ah yes, body heat. Nature's original space heater. Large families enjoyed one unspoken winter benefit: more warmth. In bed, the eldest child might sleep with the youngest, both of them surrounded by siblings like spoons in a drawer. Grandparents often claimed the warmest corner nearest the stove, deploying both wisdom and aching joints as justification. And if you had a dog, congratulations. That furry rascal was now a prize space heater on legs. Cats, when they deigned to acknowledge your chilly existence, could also be pressed into service, though only under stern negotiation and the implicit threat of more dogs. That's not to say insulation efforts never crossed over into village-wide creativity. Some communities built double walls, filling the gaps between with sawdust. Others banked snow itself against houses, proving once again that if you can't beat winter, you might as well press it into loyal service. And so, with homes wrapped in quilts, stuffed with straw, and bolstered with a community-wide sense of determined fatigue, settlers faced each long night with a mixture of resourcefulness and resignation. Because in truth, insulation for the early settler wasn't so much a product as it was a philosophy, a whispered promise, a bargain struck with the elements that said, "You may nip at my nose, but you shall not have my toes." As the fire's glow flickered gently against the oiled parchment, casting strange, ghostly shadows across patchwork walls, the settler's world grew still. Tonight, the insulation might not be perfect, but between the draped quilts, the sleeping dogs, and the quiet hum of wind outside failing to get in, it felt enough. And just beyond the cabin walls, beneath snow-laden pines and a moon quietly tending to the stars, lay another secret of survival, one not made of wool or mud, but of a community. Out beyond the snow-crusted fields and creaking pine forests, early settlers began to perform a ritual that was less sacred and more survivalist, staying warm without anything resembling central heating. This was the part of winter where the charm of crackling fires had faded into soot-stained walls and the suspicion that one's eyebrows had been singed off sometime around Tuesday. And yet, somehow, amid the icy drafts and frostbitten boots, they not only endured, but rather quaintly, they made it a lifestyle. Let us begin with a daily marvel. The morning. Not your modern, espresso-scented, fleece blanket kind of morning. No, in a winter cabin, the morning began with a ritual known affectionately as yelling at the fire to please, just light already. Hearths that had smouldered through the night were now moody, half-asleep piles of ash, and reigniting them involved a medley of flint, steel, pine kindling, and a disturbing amount of muttered expletives that remained historically undocumented, but were definitely present. Once the fire was revived, the rest of the house remained resolutely cold, because insulation in the 1700s was more of a philosophical concept than a tangible material. Most homes featured walls thin enough for squirrels to hold conversations across. Settlers retaliated with ingenuity, hanging tapestries, stuffing cracks with rags, or sleeping in a heap of humanity designed less for comfort and more for the efficient transmission of shared body heat. Picture a human lasagna, layered in wool blankets, with the family dog tucked somewhere near the feet, heating all parties by sheer moral support. Now, the beds themselves were small, comically small, designed in a time when people were apparently both shorter and more willing to share elbow space. A family bed could include mother, father, several children, perhaps an in-law or two, and an overwhelming sense of why are your feet so cold. Privacy wasn't really a concept back then. Your business was everyone's business, especially if that business involved snoring. And believe it or not, many wore caps to bed, not just because it looked quaint in oil paintings, but because ears freeze surprisingly fast when the temperature indoors barely nudges above freezing. The famous nightcap, soft and floppy, was less about fashion and more a silent protest against frostbitten lobes. Clothing choices during the day were another form of cozy rebellion. Wearing layers wasn't optional, it was a lifestyle. Linen undershirt, followed by woolen shift, topped with a waistcoat, over which a second waistcoat might casually drape. If you were going outside, you added a cloak, mitts the size of small livestock, and possibly all the blankets you owned simultaneously. By the time you were ready, you resembled a particularly ambitious onion. But while sub-zero temperatures argued loudly against comfort, the people of the time found other ways to keep the hearth of the spirit stoked. Shared storytelling by firelight was the nighttime Netflix, with tales drifting somewhere between hard-earned wisdom and elaborate excuses for why the chickens had escaped. Candlelight, flickering gently on wooden walls, cast shadows with personalities of their own. And if you squinted into that amber glow, every spindle or rocking chair seemed like an elderly relative eager to dispense unsolicited advice. Even food, though simple, became part of the warm routine. Porridge in the morning, thick, steaming, and often suspiciously grey, was the physical embodiment of its better than nothing. Midday meals featured stew so heavy they could theoretically hold the house up. And after dinner, perhaps a small tot of rum or something herbal, to brace the nerves for another night of ominous creaks and howling winds whispering secrets under the door. What settlers lacked in thermodynamics, they made up for with obligatory cheer. It helped that complaining was treated not as weakness, but as a sort of national pastime, second only to chopping all the wood you had just used last night. And through all this, people knitted, they hummed, they carved whistles out of sticks with alarming intensity. Anything to keep the hands busy and the spirits above freezing. So as we settle deeper into this dusky reverie, let's imagine ourselves wrapped in 3 layers of wool, seated near a fire that threatens to go out at any moment. It's cold, yes, but it's also quiet, peaceful. The wind outside scratches politely at the window panes, but inside, the world is hushed. And just beyond that flickering hearth, a new day waits with wood to be chopped, stories to be told, and perhaps, if the weather allows, a glimpse into the curious customs of winter attire that made history way warmer than expected. If you were a weary settler somewhere in the icy north woods of 17th century New England, after misjudging just how long and horrifyingly frigid a winter could be, one thing became abundantly clear. Warmth wasn't optional. It was a full-time job. Now, the heart of that job, like the beating hearth at the center of every homestead, came down to one indispensable ritual: the fire. Ah yes, fire. That magical crackling beast that turned cold into comfort and meal scraps into soups, unworthy of poetry, but worthy of survival. But make no mistake, keeping a fire alive in a drafty log cabin was about as romantic as trying to potty train a goat. It was noble work, but involved more soot, more sneezing, and far more existential doubt than the ballads let on. Settlers didn't just pop a log in and call it a day. No. Fires had to be nurtured, like a pessimistic toddler, fed carefully and watched around the clock. During the day, the fire was king, burning bright to warm the hearth, dry the clothes, bake groaning loaves of coarse bread, and accidentally roast your socks if you weren't careful where you stood. But nighttime? Nighttime was trickier. You couldn't let the fire go out entirely, because rekindling it in the morning meant precious minutes lost to flint striking and grumbling. So instead, our clever ancestors became masters of the banking technique, not to be confused with 21st century investment strategies. 17th century banking involved tucking hot embers deep in ash before bedtime. The thick ash acted like a cozy winter blanket, preserving the heat like a smouldering deposit until dawn. If all went well, you woke up, gave the hearth a little whisper of breath, added kindling, and poof, fire anew. If all went poorly, well, congratulations, it's frostbite o'clock. But fire alone wasn't enough. Not when the wind howled down the chimney like an angry cello player, and the chinks in your cabin let the air in with all the subtlety of an enthusiastic burglar. So insulation, they got creative. Woven rugs hung on the walls to keep out drafts. Straw stuffed into cracks served as a kind of homemade foam insulation, if foam were extremely flammable and known to house entire civilizations of mice. Animal pelts were layered on beds, occasionally while the animals were not yet done being alive, and beds themselves. Oh yes, the classic answer was the trundle bed, or better yet, beds with heavy curtains, not for style, but for survival. That's right, 4-poster beds had practical beginnings. Close the curtains, trap your body heat, and suddenly your bed became a human-sized slow cooker. How's that for snug? And let's not forget the humble bed warmer. Metal pan on a long handle filled with hot coals, slid between sheets like a flaming ghost. Done right, it warmed your bed and made you feel like royalty. Done wrong, it introduced you to the concept of sleep arson. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxuries. Many families shared beds, children loaded like firewood across the mattress. Some even slept on hay mattresses on the floor, where warmth was negotiable, but the company of rodents was a given. Wool was gold, thick, itchy, glorious wool. Cloaks, blankets, underthings, overthings, ceremonial wool, emergency backup wool. Folks layered in it like fashionable yaks. If you could spin it, you wore it. And now we arrive at the part of the evening when even the cows enter the story. Yes, cattle and livestock weren't always stored far from the house. Sometimes, especially in harsh winters, the barn was built onto the side of the cottage, not because it looked adorable, though it kind of did, but because animals gave off heat like big muscular radiators that occasionally moo. Having your cow nearby wasn't just quaint, it was thermodynamically wise. So picture this surreal scene. Snow whipping outside, fire banked low under a hill of ash, straw wedged in every cobbled crack, the faint but comforting scent of wool and livestock, and you curled up under a mountain of pelts, as your housemate Bessie softly snores through the wall. It wasn't glamorous, no, but it worked. And in that quiet warmth, in the flicker of emberlight and the sigh of winter winds, the early settlers, half asleep and smelling faintly of sheep, dreamed of spring. But before the thaw, before the buds of life would return to the brittle trees, there was still one crucial element to discuss: the warm and wonderful wonder of soups, stews, and survival porridge. Modest meals, yes, but bubbling with flavour and fortitude. Let's warm our hands and step into that cosy chapter next. By the time January brought its full, frozen opinion to bear upon the cabin-heavy hills and homesteads of early America, the settlers were well into the rituals of a winter routine, a routine that mingled patience, resolve, and, where possible, the unapologetic pursuit of coziness. Now, mind you, cozy, in the colonial sense, didn't quite include electric blankets, pumpkin spice lattes, or fluffy socks depicting cartoon snowmen. What it did include, however, was a slightly charred squirrel stew, layers of wool that doubled as insulation, and a statement piece, and the vaguely optimistic scent of dried herbs hanging from rafters like little green chandeliers of hope. Let us pause for a moment and peer into the soft, flickering heart of a colonial hearth. The fireplace was not just the Netflix fireplace video of its time. It was the true center of life and something of a multi-trick pony. Heat source? Absolutely. Place to cook your unseasoned root vegetables to a state of near edibility? Certainly. Object around, which the entire family huddled with the practiced closeness of sardines. Without question. In those days, central heating was an idea so foreign, it might as well have been powered by witches or Frenchmen. Instead, families relied on the age-old method of simply keeping a fire burning and wearing every article of clothing they owned at once. If layering were a sport, colonial families were elite-level competitors. On particularly frigid nights, they'd throw on a cap to sleep. Nightcaps, not just for Dickensian drama queens, but practical little woolen helmets of warmth for your exposed cranium. And the mattress situation was bouncy in its own rustic way. Beds were often stuffed with straw, corn husks, or feathers, the latter being the most luxurious, and therefore the least sneeze-friendly. Depending on one's fortune, or lack thereof, the mattress of winter might smell faintly of last season's corn harvest, molting geese, or damp wool that had given up its last hope in late November. Yet, families found warmth not just in fires and fabric, but in each other. The whole lot of them, parents, children, and the occasional overly familiar goat, would pile into the same bed on the coldest of nights. It was less family bonding time, and more communal heat source with commentary. One might say it was the snuggling equivalent of an open-plan office. There were no walls, little privacy, and someone was always snoring. Now, what about food? Glad you asked, dear sleepy historian. Winter cuisine was an exercise in creativity, or perhaps courageous restraint. You see, the autumn's generous harvest had long since vanished into root cellars or the mouths of hungry adolescents. What remained was preserved, pickled onions, smoked meats, and the kind of sourdough that could double as a doorstop. Salted pork was a mainstay, although after 3 months of eating it, even the most stoic of grandfathers began to dream of lettuce with a wistful sigh. To keep drinks from freezing solid, they were kept in the root cellar next to buckets of apples, hanging onions, and that one mysterious barrel filled with what might have been cider or shoes. Hard to say. Either way, in the cold of January, nearly everything was either hard, pickled, or frozen, including tempers. But that's where storytelling came in. Around the fire, with wooden spoons scraping the last bits of something stew-like from tin bowls. Tales became the settlers' entertainment system. These might have included family legends, local ghost stories, or the immortal classic, "That time the neighbour's ox got stuck in the well." Told with enough dramatic flair, and possibly a convincing impression of the ox, these stories warmed the soul while the wind shrieked outside like a banshee that had misplaced her mittens. In those rare moments when stillness overtook the cabin, when the last ember glowed in the hearth, the children dozed beneath their patched quilts, and even the goat had stopped narrating its dreams. There came a quiet testament to the resilience of these frozen pioneers. Without thermostats or Bluetooth fireplaces or even 2-day shipping on hot water bottles, they had made their peace with winter, not by defeating it, but by knowing its ways. And as the wind danced its ghostly gig outside the frosted panes, the settlers dreamed not of summer, not yet, but of growing seeds, warm bread, and the blessed day they would unlayer just slightly. Of course, not every dreamer would get through the season without discovering winter's little surprise tricks. But that is a matter for another firelit evening. By midwinter, when snow had woven its quiet white quilt across every roof, trail, and fence post, early settlers had grown intimately acquainted with their fireplaces, perhaps even a little too acquainted. Cooped up in their cabins with curls of smoke brushing soot onto the low beams, families shared everything: warmth, food, and, unfortunately, a strong scent of wet wool and unwashed socks. The perfume of survival. Wood stoves and hearths, while endlessly photogenic in historical reenactments, were less than romantic in practice. In truth, the colony's favourite house guest was not dear cousin Jonathan, but rather the woodpile, which dictated everything from sleep schedules to pacifying toddlers. The average household needed roughly 30 to 40 cords of wood for a full winter, a stack about as large as a small barn. And that was if your cabin's chinking didn't resemble Swiss cheese. Families burned through wood, and patience. Each gust of wind seemed to whistle through the cracks with the gleeful malice of a mischievous spirit. Drafts weren't rare. They were roommates. You could sit with your boots inches from the fire, and your back could still be kissed by the bite of the icy air sneaking through the log walls. It was the historical version of front row seats to temperature-based betrayal. Thick quilts were piled like lasagna atop beds, made from layers of wool, linen, and dreams sewn together with calloused fingers and weeks of candlelit stitching. Children sometimes slept 3 or 4 to a bed, their combined body heat the original version of central heating. The youngest was often tucked in the middle, a snuggled, sniffling human coal, flanked on both sides by equally weary siblings. For clothing, layering was the rule, the law, and the gospel. Underclothes, woolens, shawls, mitts, and caps were worn freely indoors and out, forming a kind of portable insulation system with the fashion sense of a deeply confused scarecrow. Men might wear their coats at the table. Women cooked in layers so thick they rustled like autumn leaves. Toddlers were barely distinguishable from bundles of discarded laundry. Food, of course, had shifted into its winter behaviors. Cabbage had transformed into sauerkraut. Apples had shriveled and sweetened into wrinkled wisdom. Fruit, and anything remotely perishable, had either been salted, smoked, or pickled into submission months before. Root vegetables were stored in root cellars, which offered the twin benefits of food preservation and a sudden numbing chill that reminded one precisely why you preferred hearth over hole. Water didn't flow from taps, it cracked in buckets. Every drop was hauled anew, and every morning's first sip required nudging the ice out of the way. For settlers in colder regions, it wasn't uncommon to discover that the inside of the cabin had formed its own delicate, lacy frostwork on the windows, if they were lucky enough to have glass. Otherwise, parchment, oiled cloth, or grease paper filtered the white light of a pale sun as it climbed sluggishly over the trees like an old man from a creaky chair. Winter boredom was another beast entirely. With farming at a standstill and long days spent largely indoors, even quarrels became entertainment. Card games frayed from overuse. Stories were told and retold until even the family dog could lip-sync the punchlines. Children found subtle ways to annoy each other, poking cold toes into warm ribs, say, or inventing rules for games, only to change them mid-play. Truly, no board game ever required as many house rules as a snowbound try at birchbark checkers. And yet, within it all, there was a strange rhythm. The days were slow, yes, but purposeful. There was rattling laughter mixed with the crack of wood splitting. Shadows danced across log walls while embers whispered and glowed in the ashes. A mother told a story for the 1,000th time, and still the children leaned in, not because they didn't know the ending, but because it felt safe to know what would come next. Midwinter, in all its frozen grandeur, asked settlers to be still, to listen, and to endure. They had no thermostats, no radiators, no backup generators, just resourcefulness, thick mittens, and a stubborn refusal to freeze. Now, with the coldest part of the season chewing at every lintel and beam, the question wasn't just about keeping warm, but about how cabin life itself transformed people, inside and out. Let's slip deeper under the covers and see what happens next, when the icicles grow long and tempers grow short, with a roaring fire and an ear pressed to the wall. By the heart of winter, the settlers' cabins had stopped being humble shelters and started to resemble trial runs for refrigerator interiors. Wooden walls stuffed with moss, fur, and whatever else didn't scream, still groaned and cracked with cold. The cheerful crackle of the hearth became the only regular music in a season that liked to whisper frostbite through chinks in the logs. To survive indoors without modern heating was, in many ways, a group performance. And that performance, let's call it the blanket ballet, starring everyone in a wig-warmed paper nightcap and 3 layers of wool. The show opened at sunset and ran until sunrise, with minimal intermission for bodily functions, unless you were brave or unwise enough to venture outside the warm pile of humanity for a frosty rendezvous with the outhouse. Yes, huddling. Glorious, undignified huddling. It was survival's coziest tactic. Children, grandparents, neighbors, even livestock on the chilliest nights. Everyone clustered near the fire in what can only be described as a historically necessary cuddle puddle. Settlers also had their winter uniforms, thermal armor by any other name. Long underwear made from scratchy homespun wool that could start an argument with your skin. It itched so thoroughly that scratching became a communal pastime. Wool socks, wool mittens, wool everything. If it didn't scratch, it probably didn't work. Food, too, added its own little warmth. Winter stews burbled all day, offering not just calories, but aromatherapy. Salt pork, root vegetables, and occasionally something green that had survived pickling season. For a pioneer, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable. It was a perfume, a fuel source, and a commitment to digestive adventure. The ovens, had their own special role in the great winter survival plan. Many hearths had a side nook or cast iron oven tucked in the masonry. These spots, warm but not scorching, became the original heated mattress pads. Flat stones were baked all day, then wrapped in cloth and slipped into beds beneath the sheets to gently radiate warmth like a very obedient pet rock. Sometimes, if you were resourceful or very sleepy, you just drag your bedding next to the hearth and declare it a new bedroom. No zoning permit needed. But warmth didn't just come from fire and friction. No, some of it was psychological. Storytelling, for example, was the winter evening's Netflix. Tales of ghosts, soldiers, family legend, biblical drama, and the occasional riotous recollection of a neighbor's cheese mishap kept minds engaged and anxieties parked beside the hearth. In a life so often hard-earned and hand-wrung, storytelling gave the brain something warm to wrap itself in. And let us not forget the truly revolutionary invention, the bed warmer. A shallow, lidded pan with a long handle, filled with embers from the fire, and slid between the sheets before bedtime. It was effective, yes, but it required both training and courage. One didn't want those embers to turn your straw mattress into a meteor crater. People became highly skilled in the art of ember dragging, essentially Victorian curling with a lot more at stake. Then there were draft dodgers, not the political kind, but the kind you made with scrap fabric and filled with sawdust or sand. They lined the bottom of doors or windows and sat sternly like tiny upholstered guardians shouting, "You shall not pass," to errant breezes. An underrated frontier hero, the draft stopper. Of course, despite all efforts, condensation still iced on windows and breath puffed visibly indoors, well past sunrise. Children wrote their names in frost, and adults responded by muttering curses into mugs. But these were the rhythms, the rituals that knit people and seasons together. Cold wasn't just a threat, it was an ongoing negotiation. And the settlers learned how to sweet-talk the season with layers, laughter, and just enough calories to keep dignity intact. As night drew long and silence returned to the cabin like a polite guest, the embers glowed low, and the family slept tangled like spoons in a drawer. Above them, the roof hissed with snow melt dripping to freeze again. Soon, as February tiptoes toward March and the corners of winter begin to blunt, settlers would start measuring time in degrees warmer, not colder. But before that, there was maple sugaring to look forward to. Though sweet was a relative term when the sap itself had to be coaxed from the tree like a very shy socialite. Ah yes, the next chapter belongs to the sugar season, when trees wept, syrup and sleepy homesteads stirred to life. But for now, let's let the fire dim with a gentle sigh. In the deep heart of winter, when the snow lay like a sleepy quilt across the land and the sun seemed to have taken a long vacation somewhere southward, with better seafood, early settlers turned to one of their most enduring winter companions, community. Ah yes, before vacation packages or digital group chats, humans did the old-fashioned thing. They sat in circles, inside one-room cabins as drafty as a politician's promises, families squeezed together like root vegetables in a cellar bin, their warmth rising collectively to combat the chill that seeped in through logs and stubborn corners. Let us paint the scene clearly. Imagine a winter evening. The wind growls at the walls, as if mildly offended the house exists. Inside a ragtag orchestra of creaking floorboards, bubbling stew, and the occasional cough plays a tune of survival. And at the center of it all, a family, maybe 3 generations deep, huddling near the hearth like pilgrims near a pie. In such rustic indoor societies, no one had personal space. Instead, they had something better. Shared burdens, shared blankets, and occasionally shared lice. Charms of the age. Winter in early settlement days wasn't merely endured, it was observed like a stubborn relative you had no choice but to tolerate fondly. The cold gave rhythm to life. Candle stubs were tallied like gold coins. The supply of firewood was recounted daily, often with the accusatory suspicion of, did someone sneak an extra log in the night? Firewood, you see, was the original streaming service. Everyone wanted more, but supply was finite, and binge burning wasn't an option. But within these snowy months, the routine of shared evenings also gave rise to a quieter, deeper magic. The stories. With daylight scarce and night almost theatrically long, oral storytelling flourished like winter beards and conspiracy theories about how warm it probably was in France. Parents told tales of old country winters, of wolves that danced in the distance, of saints who turned rivers into wine and wine into headaches. Grandparents elaborated, embellishing episodes with suspicious detail, implying they may have once arm-wrestled death himself near the smokehouse. Children, wide-eyed and squishable under too many layers of homespun wool, absorbed these tales like hot broth, carrying them forward into the next generation. It was the art of staying warm through memory and myth. Neighbours, too, braved the ice-blanketed roads to gather in someone's home for a social evening. Barn dances took up surprising popularity in winter. The logic: if you're bouncing around trying not to step on someone's frostbitten toe, you're generating heat. These events offered the twin luxuries of social contact and body warmth, both in precious supply. And then there were quilting bees. Far from being exclusively pleasant affairs, they were practical gatherings where multiple women collaborated on stitching heavy quilts, usually indoors, usually with gossip that could melt the snow off your boots. Nothing warmed a room like a conversation about who added too much salt to the stew or whose cow had mysteriously produced twins. Community included the animals too. Settlers often brought livestock into the lower level of their cabins during the coldest nights. Pigs, goats, cows, all under hoof and roof. If you're imagining this as some kind of cozy Disney moment, pause. The scent alone would make a strong man weep like an onion. But when the mercury dipped and frost crept in like a nosy uncle, every warm body mattered, no matter how mooish. All of it, the shared meals, the layered quilts, the musicians with frozen fiddles, the elderly women who knitted like their needles were on fire, was a testament to communal resilience. Separated, the cold could win. Together, they held it at bay, night by night, story by story, bowl of stew by steaming bowl of stew. Of course, not all neighbourly visits were welcome. Folks had to be careful whom they invited over. Some guests were known to loiter near the hearth like cats, well past the telling of the third ghost story, hoping for one more ladle of soup or a discreet nap on the floor. Hospitality had its limits, especially when the deer sausage supply ran low. So as the snow thickened outside, forming drifts like frozen soufflés, settlers leaned ever more into each other, figuratively and literally. Because when the oil runs low, the cow shares your hallway, and the silence outside is broken only by the sound of trees sighing in the cold. The real warmth comes not just from firewood or blankets, but from people. And with winter deepening and another gust rattling the window panes, the settlers would settle, once more, into their circle, drowsy smiles forming as the next tale took flight beside the flickering hearth. A tale we'll join as our next hush of night unfolds. As the wind howled mournfully through the cracks in a settler's wooden cabin, the scent of soot and pine lingered in the hunched air, like a memory that forgot to leave. Winter was not merely a season. It was a house guest that overstayed its welcome, stole your firewood, and politely declined to leave your joints unfrosted. To survive its visit, early settlers had to develop a particular brand of cheerfulness, somewhere between stubborn optimism and the resigned laughter of people trying to bake bread at 15 degrees. Though their homes were not exactly blueprints for modern insulation, the settlers did have some rather creative and surprisingly cozy methods for keeping warm, not the least of which was strategically optimizing body heat. Yes, my dear listener, welcome to the ancient art of the communal huddle. In many households, winter nights were an exercise in strategic stacking. Families didn't sleep in separate rooms. They didn't even dream of separate beds. Most simply piled together on a shared straw mattress, covered with as many quilts as could be stitched, traded, or stolen from the family goat's personal stash. With 10 children, 2 parents, and 1 confused cat, all crammed in like spoons in a drawer, the bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a furnace with snoring. Layering was the other secret ingredient in this wintry recipe. And no, not the chic sort found in city boutiques, but rather a patchwork of wool and flannel garments so thick and overlapping, a person could attend a birthday party and a funeral without ever changing. Clothing was rarely removed in winter. In fact, it was considered suspicious if someone undressed voluntarily. Such behavior typically indicated madness, scurvy, or being English. Then there was the humble footstone. No, not a mythological relic or poetic metaphor, but a literal chunk of warmed rock. Heated in a hearth and wrapped in cloth, these stones were placed at the foot of your bed for warmth. If you were lucky, it didn't roll up and burn your shin in the middle of the night. If you were unlucky, well, welcome to homemade shish kebab. And you mustn't overlook the iconic warming pan. A shallow metal pan with a long handle, filled with embers or hot coals, and slipped between the bed sheets to preheat them before sleep. Settlers used them with reverence, care, and no small dose of fear, as no one desired an evening that ended in accidental mattress ignition. Living spaces themselves became instruments of survival. Most cabins were essentially 2-room boxes, with the hearth positioned so it could exhale heat through every available beam. The kitchen and bedroom were often the exact same space, primarily because moving more than 10 feet meant losing the feeling in your extremities. As long as the stew didn't simmer too enthusiastically and set your socks on fire, it was perfectly logical to nap right beside the bubbling pot. Despite the frost creep along the windows and the mysterious drafts that defied all physics and logic, winters brought with them a certain softness. Quilting bees, knitting circles, and cider-infused storytelling sessions created a social resilience that functioned as emotional insulation. Hardship has a way of gluing people together, sometimes literally. If the molasses had spilled on the floor and temperatures dropped below freezing, even food took on the character of insulation. Porridges were thick enough to double as wall putty. Root vegetable stews starred as hearty thermal meals that could remain hot in a pot buried near the hearthstones. Settlers engaged in stone boiling, a technique where they'd heat rocks in the fire, drop them into a birch bark vessel filled with water and ingredients, and patiently wait for a bubbling reward that tasted faintly of charred optimism. And let us not forget the unspoken heroes of pioneer wintertime. The pets, dogs, cats, and occasionally half-domesticated raccoons were welcomed into sleeping arrangements not out of affection, but necessity. A dog curled at your feet was not just a companion. It was a fuzzy, living thermal sock with ears. Outside, the cold clarified everything. Icicles grew like beards on rooftops. Trees snapped in the night like the universe cracking its knuckles. But inside, amidst the aroma of wood smoke, sourdough and slightly damp mittens, settlers carried on, chapped, chilly, and profoundly determined to see the spring. And with these remarkably overheated bedsheets and ember-filled biscuits under their belts, they steeled themselves for the next frost. Oh, but their bravery had limits, especially when it came to one winter custom that truly pushed the bounds of their patience and ingenuity, which of course involved using the bathroom, but we'll tiptoe toward that frigid topic next. In the deep heart of winter, when the wind howled like a bored banshee, rehearsing at full volume, and snow made its fourth unapologetic attempt to sneak into every crevice of the cabin, it was the under-celebrated genre of wintertime footwear that stood between the settlers and the chilling embrace of frostbite. No, not boots with thermal insoles or self-heating socks with a USB port. The early settlers had something far more charming. Feet wrapped in layers of ingenuity, desperation, and occasionally yesterday's leftover stew cloths. You see, in the absence of modern luxuries like Gore-Tex or even factory-standard rubber soles, our stalwart pre-industrial friends had to do a bit of creative foot wrangling. In the colder colonies, people often padded their shoes with rabbit fur or straw, a sentence which, funnily enough, might also describe a rustic living room in Vermont today. Feet were lovingly wrapped in what scraps could be spared: old rags, worn-out linen, and if your neighbor was feeling particularly generous, a piece of their grandmother's moth-eaten petticoat. Nothing says community spirit quite like borrowing someone's family heirloom to stave off gangrene. And no discussion of staying warm without the benefit of central heating would be complete without mentioning the humble but heroic bed warmer. Now, imagine a little metal pan filled with glowing coals, attached to a long wooden handle, and slipped gingerly between cold sheets before bedtime. Gingerly, mind you, because placing red-hot embers beneath your blanket was a bold game of chance. Would it warm your feet or turn your mattress into a modest funeral pyre? Surprisingly, most folks preferred to hedge their bets. A careful hand and a strong sense of smell usually prevented disaster. Bed warmers were especially popular in New England, where the nights were long, the chill was stubborn, and mattresses were arguably flammable. On particularly bitter evenings, those nights when the sky looked like a dark wool blanket and the air was sharp, enough to etch glass, families gathered close not only for warmth, but for sanity. One body provided a bit of heat. 6 bodies resembled a mid-level furnace. This was the golden age of communal sleeping, when no one had boundaries, and everyone shared breath, space, and the distant hope that someone had bathed recently. Evenings were passed in layers. Wool piled atop wool, scratchy flannel piled atop scratchier flannel, until the only thing visible beneath the mound was a faint wisp of steam and the occasional sneeze. Entire families would burrow into a single bed like a pack of determined field mice, emerging only in the morning, or in the event of an accidental collapse triggered by an ill-timed sneeze. Another cherished tradition, the hot stone. Heated in the fireplace until nearly too hot to touch, stones were enveloped in cloth and placed beneath blankets at the foot of the bed. This was the foot warmer's stoic cousin, less risky than the bedpan of burning coals, and less likely to cause third-degree burns before bedtime. Especially useful, too, in homes with stone floors, where socks alone were more of a suggestion than a defense. And of course, there was the final line of defense, the nightcap. Not the drink, although plenty of that flowed once the chores were done, but the actual nightcap, a woolen hat designed to make you look like a sleepy wizard or a very poorly dressed candle thief. Heat escapes through the head after all, and every degree mattered. Even the babies wore them. There are countless folk paintings of infants in tiny knit beanies, tucked like potatoes into wooden cradles the size of gardening toolboxes. Wool was everything. It was clothing, bedding, insulation, and occasionally a topic of song. A nice woolen stocking could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. And if someone was lucky enough to own a pair knitted by a generous aunt with strong fingers and a poetic spirit, then all the better. There is historical suggestion somewhere between footnotes and folklore that such stockings could improve morale by as much as 40%. The winter was cruel, yes, but human beings, when given enough cold weather and not enough insulation, become surprisingly inventive. And as we drift quietly onward, imagine the glowing hearth dimming to embers, the hush of the snow whispering against the cabin walls outside, and a long, muffled yawn shared by an entire family cozily stacked in bed like human pancakes. Let's wander next into the subtle art of wintertime cooking, a tale where survival meets soup and stew becomes seasonal poetry. The wind had teeth by January, sharp little fangs that bit figures hunched against it, wrapped in every layer of wool, linen, and hope they could muster. In the wooden cabins of early settlers, those without a proper understanding of insulation learned two important facts very quickly. 1. Logs may look solid, but they invite drafts in like uninvited party guests. And 2. Heat rises, which is both scientifically accurate and emotionally spiteful when it's your freezing toes left below. But necessity, ever the cranky midwife of invention, gave birth to some truly charming winter solutions. Settlers began stuffing every nook and chink between logs with mud, moss, or, when ambition ran low and desperation high, old rags and animal dung. An aromatic solution, yes, but warm. And in the end, wasn't that the true perfume of survival? Inside these cabins, the hearth commanded center stage. Almost everything orbited around the fire, from cooking to drying damp mittens to storytelling, and occasionally half-hearted attempts at romance, though the latter usually faltered when someone had to get up and stoke the coals. Without central heating, warmth wasn't a passive luxury. It was an active relationship. You had to feed it, stoke it, coax it back to life at 3 a.m. when a howling gust tore through the chimney and snuffed the flame like a rude houseguest. And even when the hearth roared cozily, only those within a tight 2-foot radius truly basked. The rest of the room fell into shadowy, frost-bitten purgatory. To sleep warm, families employed that most time-honored of heating strategies, strategic snuggling. Children were tucked in together in one bed, often 3 or 4 to a mattress, lined up like logs themselves, slumbering, half-frozen little firewood. Parents might sleep with thick nightcaps, flannel layers, and the occasional complaint about knees pressed into places one would rather not discuss. At night, beds were armed with more than just blankets. Hot stones, heated in the hearth and wrapped in flannel or tucked into cast iron pans, were slipped between sheets to battle the cruel injustice of pre-warmed bedding being 2 centuries away. These steaming stowaways lent heat to otherwise Arctic slumber, although occasional yelps have been recorded when a stone strayed too far south. Cold didn't stop at the threshold either. Windows, often little more than greased paper or thin panes of glass, if the house was lucky, offered little resistance to Frost's artistic ambitions. Every morning, settlers awoke not only to the promise of survival, but also to elaborate frost flower patterns splashed across their interiors. Nature's quiet apology for turning the inside temperature into a dare. And then there were the clothes. Not merely garments, but daily acts of insulation. Wool, heavy and scratchy, was the reigning monarch of winter wear. Flax got its moment too. Homespun linen underthings clinging loyally to skin like cozy, judgmental petticoats. Clothes were rarely washed during the cold season, because wet fabrics could freeze into sculpture and also, possibly, murder. Hygiene took a back seat to frostbite prevention. For those tending livestock, the pre-dawn trek to the barn became a test of devotion. Farmers layered on coats, mittens too stiff to bend, woolen scarves wrapped thrice around faces, and boots stuffed with straw because they hadn't yet invented Gore-Tex, but had definitely heard of cold toes. The animals didn't thank them, of course. Chickens glared from their perches. The cow might offer a nasal sigh, but within these early morning rituals bloomed a stoic courage, part habit, part necessity, and part sheer refusal to let the bitter air win. Yet even with hardship, there was community. Neighbors gathered when they could, clustering near fires, swapping news and mild gossip that softened the bite of isolation. Quilting bees became social events. Cider warmed in kettles. Fiddle tunes somehow shook snow from brows. Survival came with song, with communal laughter that fogged up windows and hearts alike. And in the quiet hours, as the wind huffed against log walls and the fire settled into a low, dreaming glow, settlers pulled blankets tight and listened to crackling embers, to snores of sleeping kin, to wine pressing its mouth against the shutters in a hushed, icy lullaby. Just beyond the cabin door, the snow lay in thick mounds, waiting. But inside there was warmth, rough-hewn, hard-earned warmth, and the distant promise of morning. Speaking of promises, there's a curious tale about how one very special winter led to an invention every settler didn't know they needed until it arrived. By late January, when snow had entered its third month of looming like a judgment from the sky, early settlers perfected the fine art of not going anywhere. No errands, no spontaneous walks, and certainly no half-baked notions of stepping outside for some air. The air was frozen, and so were the notions. Wintertime turned the average homestead into a kind of low-tech spaceship orbiting a sunless planet somewhere between exhaustion and oatmeal. Families learned to exist within only a few rooms, sometimes even just one, sealed against the cold with more desperation than insulation. They lived together like spoons in a drawer, warm, close, and occasionally prone to poking each other the wrong way. To pass these frosty days, they turned to crafts with names cheerful enough to forget why they were necessary. Quilting, for instance, was not just a hobby. It was domestic survival disguised as creativity. It was a team effort too. Older kids stitched through the awkwardness of adolescence with needle and thread, while adults turned fabric scraps into squares of sanity. Quilts didn't just go on beds. They were hung on walls, nailed over windows, and sometimes worn like the world's slowest fashion trend. Cooking, once a daily necessity, was elevated to the status of performance art. The hearth roared all day, fed with more logs than a summer camp ghost story circle. And meals became slow symphonies of boiling, stewing, and bread dough pondering. A single pot of bean stew could last 3 meals, 4 arguments, and at least one moment of existential dread before inevitably transforming into soup, and then thin soup, and then regrets. Water, of course, was not so simple. There were no indoor taps to turn. Instead, brave souls, usually the ones who had lost a game of chance or were youngest in the family hierarchy, ventured out with buckets to the creek or well. The task was simple: retrieve water, don't fall in, and try not to freeze mid-haul like some kind of domestic statue. Let us take a calming pause to appreciate the unsung hero of the winter cabin, the ash bucket. Born from the ashes, literally, of every morning's warming ritual, the ash bucket was part janitor, part ancient fire inspector. Dumping ashes required patience. Wind, after all, does not respect face or dignity. A small gust could send grey sprites into your eyes, your clothes, or that soup you were trying to stretch a little longer. But if cabin fever knocked at the door, politely, then insistently, there were games. Early versions of charades, riddles passed down like heirlooms, wooden puzzles, whittled into being by hands that had been absolutely banned from further attempts at quilting. Children played with hand-carved toys, so simple they'd make a Lego cry with confusion. The older folks rolled dice their grandfather had brought over in a pocket filled with sawdust and dreams. What you must remember is this: the heart of winter was not its cold, but rather its slowness. The days unspooled like thick twine, long and stubborn and curiously hypnotic. People tucked themselves into reading if they were lucky enough to have books. Those few precious volumes often read again and again until lines entered the oral tradition. And yes, the Bible was high on that list, but so were cookbooks, which doubled as reading material and daily motivation. Winters forced conversation. Families grew familiar, not always pleasantly, but reliably. You could track mood swings like weather patterns and decode footstep sounds like Morse code. That was Dad going to check the chimney. That was Grandma preparing to misplace her spectacles again. And that was someone before breakfast, clearly hungry and not yet fit for human contact. And in the quietest hours, the ones where the wind howled in ancient tongues and the windows leaned in just a little, you could hear the creak of the rafters and the murmur of the past. Neither fully sleeping nor truly awake. Early settlers knew, deep in their bones and beneath 16 layers of wool, that winter was a test of stillness. Not everything needed solving. Some things only needed enduring. And so they stayed put, survived, fussed and flourished in small, lovely routines. Which, conveniently, brings us to what happened when spring twitched its first frostbitten toes and tried, valiantly, to return. Sometimes, the craving for heat isn't just about temperature, it's about togetherness too. And no one knew this better than the early settlers, bundled in homes no better insulated than a modern cardboard box, relying on wool, wit, and the power of proximity to stave off the frostbite of loneliness. And literally, frostbite. By midwinter, the effects of isolation set in. Outside, snow draped over fences and rooftops alike like an over-enthusiastic icing job from someone who'd never seen a cake before. Travel was practically impossible, unless you had a sleigh, a team of horses, and an unshakable will to visit someone equally cold and equally lonely. The rest mostly stared out their windows and hoped their neighbors still had all 10 fingers, so less people become cranky, listless, or, heaven forbid, unamused. They invented 2 things: community gatherings inside impossibly small spaces, and increasingly ridiculous entertainment. Let's begin with the humble quilting bee. On paper, it sounds like a meeting of particularly fussy insects, but in reality, it was an indoor gathering of women, though sometimes the men were roped into the stitching, or at least tolerated for their firewood hauling abilities. where everyone joined to work on a communal quilt. Their fingers worked quickly under the dim light of tallow candles, the fabric soft beneath their chilled hands, and the conversation lively enough to melt the icicles on the rafters. These weren't just stitch and sulk affairs. Quilting bees were where gossip flew faster than the shuttle on a loom. Mrs. Alder's unseasonably early cinnamon preserves, suspicious. Thomas from the Northfield, eyeing the blacksmith's daughter, noted. Meanwhile, in the corner sat an elder who'd heard the same love triangle 3 winters running and remained convinced that every romantic entanglement could be solved with a well-made cornbread. Then there were storytelling nights, where lanterns cast soft pools of golden light and grandfathers told tales that probably never happened, embellished generously with wolves in inappropriate places and snowdrifts taller than barns. No child left those evenings without believing their ancestors had once fought off a bear while churning butter mid-blizzard. Of course, outside of such cozy camaraderie, folks had to make do with other forms of entertainment, namely parlour theatricals. Picture an 1820s version of charades, but with fewer rules and a much stronger commitment to method acting. One poorly recited Shakespeare soliloquy, and the whole farmhouse was roaring with laughter. Each misquoted line, another log's worth of warmth. Try saying to freeze or not to freeze in a dramatic tone in a dim cabin at midnight, and we dare you not to earn yourself a cider refill. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't pause here to mention the true pioneer of indoor amusement, the family member who could fiddle. The violin, you see, was the Wi-Fi of the 18th century, uniting people around a single source, while they pretended not to notice that Aunt Charlotte had fallen asleep holding a knitting needle upright. Dancing was common, though generally restricted to foot-stomping jigs that required no real movement around the room, lest one bump into the apple-drying rack or the prize goat, temporarily lodged inside due to a storm. But beyond the entertainments lay the quieter rituals of keeping spirits alight. Candle making was one such meditative endeavor, a process so aromatic and meticulous that even the most hardened frontiersman found himself calming down within moments. Prepare a pot of melted tallow, dip and dry, and all the while whispering musings about how Jonathan's beard must surely be hiding a squirrel. Soap carving became its own form of expression, with creations ranging from deeply amorphous birds to something that may have been a raccoon or a potato, depending on who you asked, and young ones, too restless to sit through more quilting, whittled sticks into questionable artworks and named them after people in town. There was a strange sort of alchemy that happened in these closed-up winter rooms. The less they had, the warmer it somehow became. A handful of people, a touch of laughter, the shared labor of staying alive and entertained, and suddenly the air wasn't so icy. Perhaps it was just body heat, or perhaps it was the warmth of human absurdity, the knowledge that even in the bleakest weeks of winter, people could find a reason to gather and grin. And so the cold was not only endured, but occasionally bested by songs no one quite remembered, tales no one quite believed, and crafts no one quite completed. But that didn't matter. The wind howled outside, but the hearth held strong, and against all odds, merriment crackled louder than the frost on the window panes. Outside, snow continued to whisper its soft, slow lullaby across the land. Inside, one more tale was about to unfold, the kind that begins, as many good ones do, in the dark, with something curious overheard and a shovel left leaning by the door. As winter clouds pressed heavy upon the timbers of colonial cabins and the chill of January licked through every wooden seam, early settlers turned to their most vital element of survival, not fire, though certainly fire had its moments, but community. Yes, in a curious twist of fate, the same neighbor who borrowed your last pinch of salt in June might be the same one spooning turnip stew into your mouth come February. You see, early winter survival wasn't just about battling frostbite or rationing beans with surgical precision. It was about mutual obligation, but with fewer passive-aggressive notes and more shared mittens. Neighbors watched out for each other because, to put it plainly, if you didn't, you might wake up in spring to a population of 0 and a surplus of snow shovels. Communal wintering practices varied from place to place. In the northernmost settlements, where eyelashes froze solid before your front door latch could creak open, communal barns often doubled as emergency shelter. Families huddled together with cows, pigs, and chickens in what can only be described as a snugly smelly ecosystem. The upside? Warmth radiated from every mammal present. The downside? Highly judgmental stares from the family goat, while you change shirts behind a curtain of burlap. Winters weren't just about staying warm either. They were about staying on board. And so came the winter gatherings, the frosty salons of the frontier. Families gathered around one hearth, telling stories, twisting corn husks into makeshift dolls, or playing enigmatic games like Button Button Who's Got the Button, a game that proved an amusing pastime until someone actually lost a button and the whole afternoon descended into a chaotic button hunt under a wool rug. But even these cozy gatherings had rules. For example, you could talk politics, so long as no one started shouting about King George. You could sing songs, so long as they didn't involve greatly exaggerated fishtails or mention of British ale, which, as it happened, was a sore subject in many dry, freezing villages. And you could share a dram of whatever passed for brandy, so long as it was served from the creaky bottle kept behind the top shelf, next to dried apples and that one ointment that cured everything from toothache to sadness. Food, as ever, was the social glue, a well-beaten path to togetherness. Communal potlucks were held in barns, small churches, or even in someone's unusually large kitchen, which doubled as the local news hub. Everyone contributed what they had, a chunk of salted meat, an onion of questionable vintage, or a not quite lethal root vegetable. No one was judged unless they brought stew that was mostly water and audacity. In these frozen months, roles also became more communal. Elderly women, wrapped in shawls and wisdom, served as neighborhood apothecaries, mixing tonics by candlelight, most of which included 1 part herbs to 3 parts trust me. Teenage boys became designated snow clearers, while younger children busied themselves constructing snow creatures, some of which bore an unusual resemblance to the local magistrate. Suspicious? Perhaps. Entertaining? Absolutely. And then there were the folks who earned their keep, and some admiration, by traveling from homestead to homestead delivering news, letters, and hard truths like, "Your cousin Jeremy thinks your root cellar is haunted." They moved on skis, snowshoes, or, on rare and perilous occasions, the back of an extremely disgruntled ox who did not appreciate working winters. Some settlements devised winter watches, 2 or 3 men who would rotate the duty of patrolling through the snow-caked streets at night to ensure no chimney had gone cold and no traveller had collapsed in a snowdrift. Their lanterns glowed faint amber through the flurries, veiled in mist and obligation, their boots crunching rhythmically like a lullaby only winter could sing. In a surprising turn of rustic technology, some households even passed down treasured warming pans, long-handled bronze or copper dishes filled with embers, slid between bed covers before retiring. It was a practice that frequently led to warm toes and occasional smouldering linens, a fair trade if you asked any elder who'd survived winters when the wind howled like a gossiping grandmother with a cold. And so, in these long nights filled with creaks and candle shadows, people relied on each other, not just for warmth, but for laughter, for whispered stories after midnight, and for the occasional emergency egg borrowed through a window left open for just such transactions. As the frost deepened and owls called gently across the snowfields, something sacred stirred in the stillness, the knowledge that spring would come. But until then, survival was a shared story told in porridge, patience, and packed-together people. Soon we shall visit the hearthside one last time. When the snow begins to melt and the winter's breath fades quietly from the panes, the snow had long since surrendered to the press of boots and hooves, flattened into quiet submission by months of trudging feet and stubborn sleighs. By this point in February, perhaps March, if winter was in one of her sarcastic moods, even the icicles hanging from barn roofs drooped like sleepy eyebrows. Cold had settled in not as a visitor, but as a permanent house guest, the kind that eats all your root vegetables, but somehow also helps you chop more firewood. In those final weeks before the great thaw, early settlers lived in a sort of shared truce with winter, no longer battling each snowbank like a wool-wrapped general. They instead went about their days with the hushed endurance of people who had learned not to poke a sleeping bear, especially if the bear in question could blast you with 40-mile-per-hour winds and freeze your potatoes solid. Days were shorter than a politician's promise, and nights stretched like a quilt across the sky, though tragically, not one you could actually pull up over your nose. So they made do. They made do with stuffing every conceivable cranny in the cabin with whatever might hold heat. Wool, moss, old newspapers, occasionally a dead goose, don't ask. And when supplies ran low, as they always did, families turned to time-honored traditions of creative straining. You could stretch a candle by cutting it in half and sticking a sliver of bacon fat on the wick. You could stretch a conversation by rehashing the same gossip from September. And you could stretch a single parsnip soup across 2 meals, 3 if you were very generous with your broth. Speaking of broth, the early settlers' diet in late winter was monotonous, like a song with only one note, and that note is cabbage. If by now you were tired of boiled things, salted things, or things you weren't entirely convinced were still edible, you were not alone. Poor Ma spent most of the day rebranding leftovers. Mashed turnip became root pudding. Congealed oatmeal was breakfast loaf. And anything remotely meaty was declared stew as long as you stirred it and apologized while serving. Social life during the closing acts of winter was a fragile thing, held together only by mutual survival instincts and the vague memory of outdoor picnics. Cabin fever wasn't just real, it was practically a member of the family. Back then, settlers would cure the long, sleepy madness of winter with home-churned gossip, impromptu fiddle nights, or the legendary snowshoe socials, which were part athletic event, part dating ritual, and all frostbite. And while the grown-ups busied themselves with chores that blurred together, sweeping ashes, checking traps, mentally negotiating with the woodpile, the children made their fun where they could, sliding down icy hills on scraps of lumber or watching icicles grow on the dog, who tolerated this purely on the promise of table scraps. If you had a good dog in those days, and most of them were very good dogs indeed, they doubled as both foot warmers and emergency snowplows. But spring, though silent, was always moving. Somewhere beneath the piles of snow and the foot-thick ice crusting over the creek, things stirred. The trees, those stoic beings that hosted countless squirrel conferences all winter, began to whisper with sap. And when the sap began to run, you knew the worst was nearly over. That sticky, sleepy river of sugar began seeping through maple trunks, and humans, ever the opportunists, hauled metal buckets into the woods like caffeinated raccoons. The end of winter didn't arrive all at once. It tiptoed. A drip here, a birdsong there. You'd put your boots on expecting the usual 4 feet deep struggle, only to find your foot sinking into a slush puddle instead. This called for celebration. And so, they did. In small, tentative ways. A longer walk in the sunlight. An extra log on the fire just for comfort. A jar of apple butter opened just because. They didn't have spring yet, but they could taste it. And as stars pierced the long, silken cloud of midnight sky, folks would tuck themselves under 2 thin quilts and listen to the creak of the rafters in settling snow. By then, their bodies were lean from labor, their minds filled with visions of green things to come, and their homes, though drafty and cracked, held the warmth of shared breath and stubborn love. So sleep now, dear listener. Let frost nip only at the edges of your dreams, while inside your mind, the fires still crackle, the hearth still glows, and somewhere, not far enough to be far, but not quite here just yet, spring is on her way.